Hi everybody, welcome to the catch-up for 7 to 10 Science. Thank you for putting up with the fact that this was late. I do apologise for that. Unfortunately, something couldn't be helped. So this week is biology. I'm going to look a bit deeper into the organisation of living systems. I'm going to look at a broad overview of the major systems of the human body. Maybe we'd be here for hours and hours if I tried to cover them all. And we're going to look at the respiratory system in depth. And then we're going to look at what happens when this doesn't go to plan. So we'll look at a couple of disease processes and how the one system malfunctioning brings the whole body down. So if you remember from week 1, I think it was, we have specialized cells. I'm not going to go too in-depth with this, but before the specialized cells, there are these cells called stem cells. And each of these stem cells has all the genetic information to produce every single cell type in the body. So our specialized cells might be heart cells, nerve cells, brain cells, skin cells. They're all produced from these stem cells. So stem cells sit here on the list. They create specialized cells. So the skin is a tissue. It's made up of multiple specialized cells. We then have organs, which are made up of multiple tissue types. So in this case, the liver. It's a big, ugly looking thing. So it's under your rib cage up here. And then we have systems, so the respiratory system, the digestive system, and then we have all of the systems that make up the human body. With the respiratory system, we will look at some other animals and the similarities and differences between them. So this is blood. Blood is known as a tissue. It has multiple cell types that make up the tissue. So red blood cells, white blood cells, plasma, platelets, and a whole load of other things, all working together in unison to create the tissue. To create the tissue of blood. Blood makes up a part of the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system, depending on which textbook you read. And all of these different tissues, so the bones, connective tissue, which is blood, connective tissue, which is bone, connective tissue, which is cartilage, tendons, things that keep everything together. You have muscle tissue, so you have cardiac, which is in the heart. You've got striated skeletal muscle and smooth muscle in the intestinal wall. Now, cardiac and intestinal tissues are smooth. They are, what's the word? Unconscious. They don't. I can't sit here and squeeze myself and make my heart beat faster. Well, I probably could, but you can't actively change the rate at which your heart beats. But I can flex muscles. So they are striated. You have to actively work them, whereas smooth muscle in the stomach, which is peristaltic action, which squishes the food and pushes it down, is also smooth. Then we have epithelial. So these are usually like filters or nutrients pass through them, or things are filtered. So in the kidney, you have these filters, and they are just usually 1 cell thick. And in the skin, it's a bit different as well. So the tutorial questions for this session list the 4 main tissues in vertebrates and write it into the space. So muscle tissue, nerve tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. The function. What does the tissue do? So what do the muscles do? What do the nerves do? What does the connective tissue do? Epithelial, what does it do? So, again, second set of tutorial questions. Identify the function of the following. So they are all organs that are made up of tissues that make up a system. So find the function of these organs. So the next level is the system. So the organs. We're talking about complex animals here. Not all animals are complex, so they don't have these levels of organization. But we have this synergistic system, synergistic workings of organs that make up the system. So for the circulatory and cardiovascular, it's the heart, it's the valves, it's the arteries and veins. So we'll go through a brief overview of these systems. So cardiovascular, we have the heart, we have the veins, and we have the arteries. We also have the capillaries. But you can see it's not just one thing. It's not just the heart. Each part of this is really just as important as the last. If an artery fails, if it becomes broken, then the entire system will come down. If the heart fails, the entire system comes down. So, respiratory system. If we think that the cardiovascular system is designed to pump air, oxygen, and blood around the body, which system do you think it works really closely with? If you thought the respiratory system, you were correct. So we breathe air in, it goes into our lungs, it passes through the alveoli, which we'll go through later, into the blood, and is pumped around. If one of those two links in the chain fails anywhere, then the other one fails. They stopped teaching expired air resuscitation for a while, but they found that it didn't stop the heart from stopping eventually. So when you give someone CPR and you're pumping their chest, you also need to give them oxygen into the blood. If someone stops breathing very quickly, the heart stops beating. If the heart stops beating, almost instantly someone stops breathing. So they're very, very closely linked. See the little branches and alveoli in here, and we'll look at asthma at the end in depth as to the pathophysiology and see what happens when it doesn't go right, and all the other systems that it affects. So we have urinary system, urinogenital, genitourinary urinary system. So it's a giant filter, basically. So it filters all the bad things out of the blood, and it's a really good indicator. It's the first thing you do if you go into hospital. They'll do a urine test. They'll put a stick that tells them pretty much everything that's going on in the body. Again, if this system fails, it's really bad. That system fails, the pH of the blood goes up. You get pressure on the heart because there might be too much water in the blood. The volume might be too high. The heart begins to back up. Water begins to leak, and very quickly it affects the entire body. So we have the digestive system. So basically all our food is broken down. We break down the food, and then in the small intestine it passes through these little epithelial cells, the one cell thick lining, into the capillaries and is transported out of the stomach into the bloodstream. again, if the digestive system fails, it's not quite as drastic as if the heart or the lungs stop working. But if something here stops functioning as it should, a blockage or tears somewhere, you will end up in trouble over time. It may not happen straight away. A lot of chronic diseases are based on the digestive system, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, so on and so forth. And if this fails, then you can't really absorb any nutrients. Depending on what it is, you can't absorb any nutrients. So really, very quickly you'll begin to go downhill, and it'll begin to affect all of the other organs as well, and the system. So the skin, probably the most. I mean, they're all pretty important, really, but this is very important. We produce vitamin D via the skin. So people mistakenly say that vitamin D comes from the sun. It doesn't. It kind of does, but we have a cholesterol in our skin, so basically a fatty acid, and the sun hits that and it breaks a bond. It goes into the blood, which then goes to the liver, which makes vitamin D. The skin keeps us safe from infection. So there's lots of oils on the skin that stop fungus and bacteria from growing properly. We regulate our temperature. So you'll notice if you get too hot, you will, not too hot, if you get quite warm and sweaty, the veins in the back of your hand will pop out, and that's the body's trying to lose heat. So it does that through the skin, and the skin covers all the nerve endings. I don't know if anyone's had a bad burn, but it is very, very painful because the more you're burnt, the more surface area is exposed, meaning the more nerves are exposed. Also makes you susceptible to infection. Again, unless you get a really big burn, the skin can't really fail, so to speak. But if you get a really big burn or you have a motorbike crash and you're not wearing the protective gear, you take all the skin off your leg. So now we understand all of this. So the organism sits at the top. So yeah. Then you have ecosystems and biomes, and I mean, I'm not going to go too far into that because we only have an hour, maybe 45 minutes, maybe how long this takes. But I will do a video on the biomes and ecosystems that come above organisms. So we're now going to look at the respiratory system in depth. And from animals, basic animals, all the way up to us, which is the most complex. So the mammalian respiratory system is really complex, meaning it's really efficient, but it also requires a really specific set of environmental factors to function correctly. So if those environmental factors aren't there or something goes wrong, it very quickly goes awry or haywire. So for us to be able to breathe and to be able to have the energy and the things we can do, we need a really high surface area to volume. And I'll explain what that means further on in this presentation. So the surfaces have to be moist. So water is what all of the oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolves into. So you breathe it in, it dissolves into water in the alveoli and then passes through into the blood. But it has to be a really specific level of moisture. And what happens when that level of moisture goes up too much? We end up with pneumonia and asthma. So thin membranes, so that is so that the oxygen can quickly pass, oxygen and carbon dioxide can quickly pass through the membranes, and these are supported by vascular capillaries. So the tiny little blood vessels, you can see them at work. When you hold this down, it'll go white, and then it refills. That's the capillaries. If it doesn't go back to that color, you can't see it. So, and there's other animals, because we know that we evolved from these animals over the last few million years, 100 million years, 400 million years, I can't really remember. And we're going to look at that evolution. So, insects, cockroaches, mosquitoes, and grasshoppers exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide through their skin. There's frogs that do this as well. So you see them quite literally pumping their bodies, and that's trying to get as much oxygen and carbon dioxide as possible. So they don't have a circulatory system. And it seems simple and inefficient, but they don't have the energy capacity to produce and maintain a proper circulatory system. So these spiracles, little holes, and then they got like a lightning bolt, and the air goes in and out. And that's what why the insects often look like they're sort of pumping their bodies, because that's them breathing effectively. So you can see that here. A little bit of water down here, and they just directly with the environment. So the electron micrograph there. Looks kind of weird and freaky. So it goes straight into the water. All CO2 comes straight out of the cells, straight into the water, and out that way. It's a one-way system, so it's not very efficient. But also in saying that, our breathing is a one-way system. So we can't breathe in and out at the same time. So our breathing likely evolved from something similar to this. So fish have gills. So when the fish are swimming through the water is going past the gills and absorbing any dissolved oxygen. That might be in the water. The issue with this is there's only about 5% dissolved oxygen in the water. Air is 20.7, I think, somewhere around there, depending on where you are. So it's not very efficient. It's the theory of evolution says that we start in the water and we likely started with gills. It's a very, very similar process to the way that our lungs work. So, won't go into too much detail here because it's quite advanced. But the oxygen-rich blood goes in, comes back out this way. Oxygen-rich blood goes in. And if you look at the way our lungs work, it's a very similar concept. I won't go into too much detail, but that's how you can see the similarities there. Oxygen-rich blood goes in, the oxygen-rich blood goes to the cells, and then on the way back out, you've got the deoxygenated blood heading back to the gills. So, in order to maximize this, the water flows in a different direction to the blood. If it traveled in the same direction, you would only have 50-50, whereas it absorbs all of the oxygen from the water that it can. So running that way, whereas if it was both running the same way, it wouldn't collect anywhere near as much of the dissolved oxygen. So these guys are axolotls, cutest things in the world, but they have both gills and lungs. So tadpoles, when they start out, they have gills. When they become an adult frog, they lose those gills and they just have their lungs and the insect-like respiratory system where they pump their bodies. But these axolotls can live underwater and on the land, so they develop gills and lungs. And they're also very, very cute. So, amphibian. So, the thorax region is this region, your chest. So, anywhere under your lungs, under your breastplate and under your lungs. And the way that we breathe is with the diaphragm, which causes positive pressure, whereas frogs they don't have ribs and they lack a diaphragm. So they have to forcefully exhale and inhale. So forcefully exhaling is an energy-intensive process, whereas humans, our exhale does not require any energy. So further improving our efficiency. So they can exchange gases, so carbon dioxide and oxygen, directly through the skin. So if you pick up a frog, find a green tree frog, they say you should have wet hands because they have this layer of mucus on the outside that allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse in and out. And yes, you should always have wet hands if you pick up a frog. So, reptile. So there's 3 different kinds: squamates, crocodilians, and testudines. I would never know how to say that properly. Someone want to message me and tell me how to say it properly, that would be good. So snakes and lizards, they don't have a diaphragm, but they have ribs. So again, you see a blue-tongued lizard and it's pumping its body to force air in and out of the lungs. The big advantage of the human system is that we don't have to actively breathe out. If you breathe in and you relax, the diaphragm will force most of the air out. So crocodiles and alligators, they have both a diaphragm and ribs. Whereas the crocodiles will use the liver to compress the lungs to expel the air, whereas we use the diaphragm and our ribs. And if you look at the way the human diaphragm works, this is pretty much the same, except it's just in a different configuration. And these guys have been around for hundreds of millions of years, since the dinosaurs. So when something's been around that long without really changing, then obviously whatever it has is working for it. So turtles, they can't expand their ribs for ventilation because of the shell. Except at the top of the shell, they've got this thin sheet of tissue that flexes and allows for ventilation. So when, again, another organism that has to use force, it has to forcefully push the air out of the lungs. It's not a reflex action like it is with crocodilians and with humans. So the more energy it takes to breathe, the less energy there is to do other things. So birds, again, very active, very energetic, and they require this efficient respiratory system, much like we do. Have a set of lungs, Instead of alveoli, they have air tubules. They don't have a diaphragm, and they don't expand and contract their lungs. They use something you'll learn about later, which is partial pressure in the air sacs to move air in and out, as opposed to what we have, which is expanding and contracting the lungs. So this concept of gas exchange is essential for all living organisms, and it's the exchange of carbon dioxide out of the blood and oxygen into the blood. And at the tissue level, oxygen into the tissue, carbon dioxide into the blood. So we have cellular respiration, which is the product, the process of cells making energy. And respiratory disease, and I'll talk about one of those later on, limit the gas exchange process. So respiratory system, respiration is breathing. Talking about cells and creating energy, it's called cellular respiration. So you can see the different kinds of lungs, or gills here. We have lungs, these tracheae inside the insects where it's directly with the cells, and then these internal gills. So if we have a buildup of carbon dioxide, then we get a decrease in the pH of the bodily fluid, and this is really, really bad. Most proteins are designed to function and operate at 7.2, roughly 6.8 to 7.2. Any lower or any higher, and the proteins will begin to unfold. So nothing works. This impacts the kidneys and the urinary system, which impacts the respiratory system, which impacts everything. So not only do we need to get more oxygen in, we need to get the carbon dioxide out. There's no point getting more oxygen in if you can't get rid of the carbon dioxide. So it's a bit different for bacteria and fungi. They just exchange directly with the environment. Single cell bacteria, oxygen in, CO2 out through this process of diffusion. There are anaerobic bacteria that don't need oxygen. They use sulfur. They're generally black and they smell terrible. So now we're getting up into complex organisms. So the bigger the organism, the bigger the demand on this process. So the rate of cellular respiration is really, really high in comparison. So we have a respiratory and cardiovascular system as a whole is more complex, but the gas exchange surfaces themselves are infinitely complex in comparison. So again, we have a circulatory and a respiratory system, and they work closely together. If you're getting lots of oxygen in, but the cardiovascular system isn't getting any oxygen to the tissues, then the tissue begins to break down. So, gas exchange always takes place over a moist plasma membrane. The oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolve into the water and they pass through the membrane. So, human lungs, and we call this an energy. Breathing in is energy intensive. We need to use energy to end up producing energy. If we were having to actively breathe out, then we would not be able to do this. We wouldn't be able to be as complex as we are, because we would use more energy breathing and we wouldn't be able to put that energy elsewhere. So we need a balanced level of ventilation and blood flow. Otherwise, we breathe too quickly, we breathe too slowly, the heart beats too quickly, the blood pressure drops. And I will explain how that all ties in together when we look at asthma after this. So we breathe in the air, goes through the nasal cavity in the mouth, into the pharynx, into the trachea, down here, into the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, which are the little things that look like broccoli in the lungs, to the vascular capillaries, or the little capillaries that run through the lungs, they're very small, into the venous circulation, to the tissues, and then the oxygen is used by the cells. Once you get to grade 11 and 12, you'll learn about the fun of the different cycles that the cells in the body use to produce energy. So, nose, mouth, and throat, they draw the air in to here. They draw the air in. The air is moistened, filtered, and warm. So there's people that, nobody really breathes optimally when it's freezing cold outside. But there are people that have cold air asthma. So when the air is too cold, they breathe in, their body has a massive reaction to it. So the pharynx is the windpipe. Or if you're drinking water and you breathe in at the same time, that's why you cough. The trachea is down here. In the old movies, they used to do a tracheotomy on a plane with a blunt knife and a pen tube. If someone got something stuck here and they couldn't breathe, they would just cut a hole here, and obviously it's not that simple. So we get down to the bronchi, which are this bit here. Bronchiole, they branch off, so there's two of those. And then we have the alveoli. Which are these bits? And this is where the gas exchange between the lungs and the cardiovascular system, or the circulatory system, occurs. So see, these are all surrounded, and you'll see it in the next slide, actually. This is what the alveoli looks like. You've got all of the vascular capillaries, the veins and arteries. The air comes down here, does its thing with oxygen and carbon dioxide, and it's transported off to the rest of the body. So if you take the lungs, or the alveoli in the lungs, they would cover 70 square meters. But there's a reason why they're like this, why they kind of look like a brain, because it maximizes the surface area that's available. And then you have this alveolar epithelium, which is a single layer of cells that are flattened out, and they're covered in veins and arteries. The oxygen and carbon dioxide passes through these two. So we were talking about fish and why it's not very efficient. It's only about 5% dissolved oxygen, whereas the air is about 20%. So the air that we breathe in is less energy to obtain, and it has a higher percentage of oxygen. But with water, you don't need the really moist, really open gas exchange surface. You only need that with air. If you get a really bad burn in your lungs, so something you breathe in smoke or something similar, it dries out the lungs. So you might be able to breathe just fine, but nothing's actually getting through. So they need to be enclosed. Obviously, we couldn't have a lung just sticking out of our chest. It would dry out really quickly. Need to be in a specialized, compartmentalized part of the body, and that's what the diaphragm allows us to have. So, we never, ever, ever take a full breath of air. It doesn't happen because it's a one-way system. Air, it can only go down. Some of that air is going to get trapped down there. It's not always going to 100% in, 100% out. And that's this residual volume. And the vital capacity is what we need to breathe in at any given time. And this changes with the need for oxygen. So our vital capacity at rest is low. Our vital capacity with exercise, we're breathing a lot more. So disorders of the respiratory system. The biggest cause is usually smoking, or breathing in constantly, being exposed to environmental poisons or occupational hazards. So emphysema, again, caused by smoking, normally. And the alveoli rupture eventually because of the heat of the smoke and the contaminants in the smoke. So chronic bronchitis, if you've ever heard of brother or sister that's had bronchitis, it's a horrible hacking cough, and it's caused by inflammation of all of the bronchial tubes, which damages the alveoli. Most kids thankfully grow out of it. Some people suffer for most of their life, but it's just due to inflammation of all of this. So we have this concept of homeostasis. When everything is normal and great, the body's happy, and then the body reacts to something for some reason and causes inflammation, and all of a sudden we have bronchitis. So asthma, and I will talk about asthma in great detail in a second. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder, and we talked about having mucus in the lungs to maintain a consistent level of moisture. If you have too much moisture from thickening of this mucus, so the body's mechanism for only producing mucus at a certain thickness is gone, so it produces really thick mucus, and this gas exchange just doesn't happen. It's blocked by this mucus. So smoking damages everything because it's hot, it's filled with poisons, it's filled with particles that get into the lungs that don't get filtered out. The lungs can become blocked. I don't think I need to go on about smoking here. But with asthma, what happens is we get a thickening of these bronchial tubes. We get an increase in mucus, and we get a tightening of the muscle. And I don't know if any of you have brothers and sisters who have asthma, but it's not very nice. It comes on really quickly, and I'll go through it now on board 5 minutes or so. So asthma starts with an overreaction of the immune system. So you have immune overreaction. This causes thickening of the membranes. So you get we then get mucus production. So what happens is all of the air that does eventually get through ends up getting trapped by the mucus. And we got bronchial constriction as well. So you ever see someone having an asthma attack? They can't get any air in because everything has been constricted, and then any air that does get in gets trapped in all the mucus, and the membranes get so thick that no oxygen can actually pass through it, or no CO2 can come this way. So what happens is the body senses a drop in the oxygen concentration of the blood. The body, trying to get back to its balanced state, starts to freak out. So it goes, well, I've got no oxygen in the blood, so I'll just begin to breathe more. So the respiratory rate goes up, which causes different systems, so red, an increase in the heart rate, what we call tachycardia. This causes, both of these will cause a drop in blood pressure. So now have respiratory rate gone up. This causes a drop. Drop in the blood pH. So blood pressure causes fluid buildup. So pressure on the heart, which already has increased heart rate. Respiratory rates drop the blood pH. So we have the immune system, the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, and the urinogenital system. And all of this, if left untreated, can lead to, unfortunately, the death of the person with asthma, all because of the immune system overreacting. The oxygen concentration of the blood goes down, so the body just starts breathing like mad. So someone starts to hyperventilate. The heart rate goes up, causes their blood pressure to go down, which causes fluid buildup. The pH of the blood goes down into an acidic range, and it flows on from there. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. So thank you for watching. I'll put out a couple more videos for this one, and I'll see you on Friday.